There are stories, and then there are the echoes behind the stories. We hold the ancient texts in our hands. We read the familiar words, we learn the parables. We build our world upon them. We feel we know them. But our most ancient traditions are like vast old houses. They have rooms we no longer enter, corridors that have been sealed, perhaps for our own protection, and whispers we have chosen to forget. What if the book we think we know is incomplete? What if the most unsettling story of all wasn't a story that was added, but one that was left out deliberately? There is a verse. It's in the book of Genesis, chapter 6. It's so brief you could almost miss it. A single sentence dropped like a stone into a still pool. A whisper in a book filled with thunder. It says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them." The Nephilim. It's a single, unexplained word, a footnote in the story of Noah. Who were they? What does this mean? The text simply moves on. The story of the ark begins. The puzzle box is never opened. For millennia, this verse has haunted the margins of theology. But what if the key was a book that was buried? A text considered so profound, so descriptive, so dangerous, that it was quietly veiled and removed. A book that vanished from our world for almost 2,000 years. It is called the Book of Enoch. And it doesn't just open the puzzle box. It tells a story, not of mighty men, but of a profound cosmic wrongness. The story, as Enoch tells it, does not begin on earth. It begins in the pristine, cold, silent altitude of heaven. There, in a perfection we cannot imagine, there was an order of celestial beings. The Grigori, they were called. The Watchers. Their nature, their very purpose, was to observe. To be silent, holy witnesses to the fledgling experiment of humanity far below. From their celestial height, they watched the world unfold. They watched the first fires, the first villages, the first people. They were guardians of the wall, never to step down. They were shepherds from afar, never to touch the flock. They were complete. A perfect, cold, and eternal observation. They were the eyes of heaven. But in watching, they began to feel. In watching the brief, fragile, passionate lives of humanity, they began to experience an echo of something they had never known, imperfection, longing, a hollow in their own perfection. After eons of silent, perfect, unchanging observation, they changed. They looked down, they saw the daughters of men, they saw their fragility, their warmth, their brief, flickering lives, and they did not just observe, they desired. This was not an accident. It was not a simple, impulsive fall of passion. Enoch claims it was a conspiracy, a deliberate, reasoned choice. A leader, an angel of a high rank named Semjazah, gathered 200 of his fellows. He saw the same forbidden desire in their eyes. He knew the law. He knew the price, the cost of breaking quarantine, the cost of abandoning eternity. And yet, the desire was too strong. He proposed an act of ultimate rebellion. They descended from the heavens. They left their posts. They abandoned their nature. They gathered on the peak of Mount Hermon, a name that itself means curse. And there, under a sky that was no longer their home, they swore a binding oath. They sealed it with mutual curses. They would not turn back. They had chosen. They would take what was not theirs. And the moment their feet touched the earth, the world began to unravel. They did not come empty-handed. They came bearing secrets. To seal this unholy pact, the Watchers became teachers. But what they taught was a contamination. They gave humanity knowledge that it was not ready for. One, Azazel, taught humanity the art of war. This wasn't just a tool, it was the idea of organized violence. He revealed the secrets of metal, how to forge swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He taught them to kill efficiently. He turned stone tools into instruments of death. Humanity, which had lived in awe of the world, now learned to control it. The sacred became the profane. The sky, once a map of wonder, became a tool for divination and power. A subtle but profound shift had occurred. The world was no longer a gift, but a resource. Others taught the cutting of roots, the art of sorcery, the reading of the stars, and the signs of the moon. This wasn't enlightenment, it was a different path. A way to seek power without the divine, to manipulate the world, rather than be in awe of it. They even taught the art of adornment. The beautifying of the eyelids, the use of precious stones, and all manner of dyes. It seems so innocent. But Enoch's story suggests this was a corruption of truth, the birth of illusion, of vanity, of deceit. They gave a young, naive world 1,000 ways to turn against itself, 1,000 pieces of knowledge they were never meant to have. A poison wrapped as a gift. And from this union, this blending of the sacred and the mundane, this deliberate infection, children were born. At first, they must have seemed like miracles, the mighty men of old. They were part human, part divine, stronger, faster, taller, and more beautiful than any human, a new and powerful race. But something was deeply wrong. The blend was unstable. The Book of Enoch is chillingly specific. These children, they didn't stop growing. The text describes them reaching an impossible height, 3,000 ells, colossal. They were the Nephilim, and they were born with a void, an appetite, a hunger that could not be filled, a hunger that mirrored the illicit desire of their fathers. We are now approaching the reason this text was buried. The story of this hunger is the chapter that was deemed too terrible to tell. If this journey into the veiled side of history is one you wish to continue, consider subscribing to join us in these explorations. Because what comes next is the reason for the flood. And here, the story leaves the realm of myth and enters the realm of nightmare. This is the chapter that was buried. This is the reason the text was sealed. This is the reason for the flood. The hunger began with the land. Enoch writes that the giants consumed all the acquisitions of men. Picture a village, a community, toiling for an entire season to fill their storehouses. Grain, oil, wine, enough to survive. The fruits of an entire year of labor. Now, picture that work, vanishing, devoured in a single day by a single one of these beings. The sound of grinding, that never stops. The shadow they cast, a permanent eclipse moving over the fields. Humanity became a race of servants, toiling, working, sacrificing, their only purpose to feed the impossible, growing appetites of their giant hybrid children. But the harvest was never enough. Soon, the storehouses were empty, the fields were stripped bare, the livestock gone. The world's resources were finite. Their hunger was not. And the giants were still hungry. This is the second stage, the escalation. When the food of man ran out, the Nephilim turned on the food of God. Enoch says they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish. Try to imagine that world, a world falling silent, a sky with no birds, a forest with no animals. The sheer wrongness of a predator that has no natural place. Everything that lived was hunted, was devoured. The very ecosystem of the planet was being unmade, torn apart by a force of pure, gluttonous chaos. A world being eaten alive. And after the birds were gone, after the beasts were gone, what was left? This is the line, the one that could not be crossed, the sentence that explains everything, the reason this book was hidden. The Book of Enoch is unflinching. It does not look away. It writes, "And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind." This is not a metaphor. This is not poetry. This is the record of a world that became a charnel house. The mighty men of old were cannibals. They hunted the very beings who had given them life. The order of creation was not just broken, it was inverted. We were no longer the apex. We were prey. Imagine the fear, the psychological horror, to live in a world where you are no longer the child, but the food. To hide in caves, to watch the colossal shadows pass, to live in a state of pure terror. The ground would tremble as they approached, but the world is a finite place, and even the human race was not enough. What happened when the humans grew scarce? What happens when a plague runs out of hosts? The hunger did not end. Enoch describes a world plunged into its final madness. The giants, their hunger absolute, their minds, perhaps broken by the very wrongness of their own existence, turned on each other. They began to devour one another's flesh and to drink the blood. This is the ultimate chaos, the final, logical conclusion. A planet ruled by nothing but colossal, cannibalistic monsters, locked in a perpetual, self-devouring war, a world eating itself into oblivion. This was not a civilization. This was a nightmare made flesh. The corruption was total. The very ground itself was stained. And so, Enoch writes, the earth, in its desolation, made its accusation. A cry, not of people, but of the planet itself. A cry of blood and soil, and of a creation broken beyond repair, rose up, and finally it pierced the heavens. The answer was not mercy. It was surgery. The verdict from heaven was absolute. The experiment was contaminated. The experiment must be reset. First, the fathers, the watchers, the instigators. They were not to be given the peace of destruction. Their sentence was to be eternal, a punishment to fit the crime. The archangels, Michael, Gabriel, were sent to bind them, to cast them into the valleys of the earth. Beings of light and air, now bound in darkness and in stone. The irony is chilling. Chained in total darkness, buried alive beneath the world they had corrupted, to wait for a final day of judgment, awaiting an end that has not yet come. That was the first sentence. The second was for the earth itself. This world was too contaminated, the bloodline, the knowledge, the very memory of what was done. It was too deep. It could not be healed. It had to be washed clean. We all know the story of the Great Flood, but now we see it through a different lens. It was not a story about human sin, not entirely. It was a cosmic cleansing, an act of celestial sanitation, a desperate measure to exterminate the Nephilim, to wipe their corrupted blood, their terrible legacy, from the face of the earth, and as the last of them drowned, as their colossal bodies were buried under miles of silt and mud, the world was silent once more. And here the story should end. The world is reborn, the slate wiped clean, but it doesn't end. Let us return to that first stubborn verse, Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Afterward, after the cleansing, after the flood. How? We move forward, centuries later. The world is repopulated. Moses sends 12 spies into the promised land of Canaan. 10 of them return in terror. They are pale, shaking. They say the land cannot be taken. Why? They report, "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Enoch, who come from the Nephilim." And then they say the most telling line of all, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." This is the lingering terror. Not just that the giants were large, but that they made humanity feel small, insignificant, a psychological shadow that had survived the flood. It was a terror of scale, a deep genetic memory of a time when humanity was not the apex. These were not just tall men, they were an echo of a world that had been broken, a world that was wrong. And this echo, this shadow, persisted for centuries. It festered in the hills of Canaan, until one last defiant champion stepped out into a valley to challenge a new world, one that was supposed to be clean. The echo remained. The bloodline somehow had survived. A tiny, dormant seed that had passed through the flood and had taken root once more. The texts call them the Rephaim, the Anakim, tribes of giants that still haunted the hills of the New World. A line of descent that perhaps met its final famous end in the Valley of Elah. A 9-foot champion, a giant who came from Gath named Goliath. The story of David wasn't just a story of faith, it was perhaps the end of this story. The last defiant echo of a bloodline that should have been drowned, finally silenced by a single smooth stone. The bloodline ends, the bodies turn to dust. But the Book of Enoch asks one final and far more disturbing question. What happens to the spirit of a Nephilim when its body is destroyed? It is half divine. It cannot truly die. It is half human, but an abomination. It cannot ascend. It is trapped between the worlds. Where does it go? Enoch gives the final, terrible answer, the judgment on their spirits. They are to remain on the earth, concealed, and they shall be called evil spirits. The spirits of the giants shall be concealed on earth, and shall afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst and cause offenses. A spirit defined by an eternal, unmet hunger. The Nephilim were not truly destroyed. They were unleashed in a new and far more insidious form. The story of the giants is not a story of something that was. It's the origin story of something that is. This, then, is the legacy. Not bones buried in the earth, but a hunger that remains. What part of this forbidden story lingers most with you? The oath of the Watchers, the impossible cannibalistic hunger, or this final haunting legacy? Leave your thoughts in the quiet below. A hunger that did not drown, a void that can never be filled, a presence that did not leave, an echo still waiting in the dark.